And we proceed to the closing of
Extra omnes.
We hear those words in Latin where it means everyone out, signaling when all the non-essential people in the Sistine Chapel are invited to leave and the cardinals can begin their discussions.
So for those of you watching on television, there are a number of notaries who were there in their capacity to formally recognize the beginning of the conclave, and a number of other persons who are in attendance for various reasons. All of them are ordered out of the Sistine Chapel, and the doors will be closed, the meditation will be given, the papal MC will leave, and the solemn closing, locking, and guarding of the doors of the conclave will take place, followed by the first vote this evening. And with the exit from the Sistine Chapel, our live coverage of the Cardinals' entrance into conclave for of the 267th Pope draws to a close. We do invite you to visit our Vatican News website, Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube accounts for continuous coverage of the conclave. On behalf of Vatican Media, we'd like to thank our sound engineer Mario and our audio coordinators and all of our producers, as well as our media partners, EWTN TV, Catholic Faith Network in America, Shalom World Television's Network USA, Luminous Radio, Atma Darshan TV, Catholic TV, Uganda, Catholic Television, make this broadcast possible.
My name is Kelsey Gussie.
And I'm Christopher Wells. It's been our very great pleasure providing the English commentary and translation of the ceremony of the entrance into the conclave for you.
A very special thank you to all of you for joining us wherever you have been listening or watching. And don't forget to join Chris and our colleague Linda Bordoni again in just a few minutes at 6 p.m. local Rome time for the live commentary as we await the Cardinals' decision, and keep an eye out on the chimney on the Sistine Chapel for either black or white smoke later this evening.
Praise be Jesus Christ. Laudetur Jesus Christus.
Laudetur Jesus Christus. Praised be Jesus Christ. A very warm welcome to all of you joining us for this live broadcast as we await a possible white smoke signal coming out of the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. It's the first day of the conclave, and I'm here in Vatican Radio studio together with my colleague Christopher Wells. Hello, Christopher.
Hello, Linda, and we've just concluded the ceremony for the closing of the conclave with the cardinals. They began with a moment of prayer in the Pauline Chapel, just very close to the Sistine Chapel, and then went in solemn procession in hierarchical order into the chapel. They swore their oath of secrecy, their oath to fulfill the office of the Petrine ministry if they are elected, and to faithfully observe all of the norms for the election of the Roman pontiff. So just a few moments ago, we heard the Latin expression extra omnes, which it calls everyone to leave the Sistine Chapel except for the cardinal electors. And the cardinals are currently hearing a meditation on their duty, and we expect them to proceed to the first vote in the next half hour or so.
So, yes. Meanwhile, we have two very prestigious guests with us here today. Thank you for joining us. Philippa Hitchen, former Vatican Radio journalist, currently communications officer for the Lutheran World Federation. She was actually the person who saw the white smoke for when Jorge Bergoglio was elected as Pope Francis. And we also have a historian, a church historian, Dr. Donald Prudlow. Did I say that right,
That's
Dr. Prudlow? Welcome and thank you. He will be filling us in with lots of details. Right now, I think the best thing to do would be go to the square, where we have Devon Watkins, who's sassing out the situation. He's been talking to some of the people in the square. Hello, Devon, can you hear us? Hello. Okay, so perhaps there are some issues with telephone lines because, as you know, the whole of the Vatican has been, I don't know what the right word is, but telecommunications have been under control here, so people may have issues in connecting. Can you hear me, Devin? No. Okay. We will try again. Meanwhile, Chris, what if we go into our first insert? As Chris was explaining, the cardinals are currently in the Sistine Chapel. We've seen the extra omnes, everybody out. And we have here a program by Veronica Scaresbrick, who interviewed Monsignor Charlie Burns to tell us all about what actually happens from the moment the cardinal the chapel, and he's going to walk us through the of voting ballots and burning them.
The idea of a smoke signal probably originated because a signal had to be given to the guard on the roof of the Castel Sant'Angelo to fire the cannon to announce to the city of Rome that the new pope was elected, and that way the populace could come to the piazza. But I think the idea originated there in trying to send, a smoke signal to the chap on the top of Castel Sant'Angelo. Well, I mean, those days have passed. Ringing the bells of St. Peter's is a very appropriate innovation. Before the conclave opens, shall we say, before it actually opens technically, there's a Mass of the Holy Spirit in St. Peter's. The cardinals then go back for lunch, etc., but then return to the Vatican, go to the Pauline Chapel, get into order of precedence, and singing the Veni Creator, they process to the Sistine Chapel. when they're in the Sistine Chapel, the first thing is that the Cardinal Dean will administer the oath, and they swear individually that they will abide by the rules of the Constitution, the papal Constitution. If they're going to have a ballot, if there's no other business to be discussed, and they agree, all right, we could get on with a ballot, okay, the ballot papers will be distributed by the assistants who are there. And things are made ready that way.
And then this extra omnes.
The Master of Ceremonies will say extra omnes, and everyone who's not involved in the actual election will have to go out, with the exception of himself and the preacher. A special preacher is appointed who will turn the thoughts of the cardinals to the matter that they're about to undertake, and ask them to have nothing else except, Almighty God before them when they come in conscience to vote for a particular candidate. At that stage, the Master of Ceremonies and the preacher come out. The junior cardinal deacon closes the door behind them, and he then will either open or close that door according to the needs of the conclave.
So there really is a closing, physical closing.
Oh, there is a physical closing. In the past, it was closed inside and outside. There used to be the guardian of the conclave, who would be Prince Chigi or somebody like that, with the Governor General of Vatican City. He had the obligation of seeing that outside was also closed, and the inside was closed. That really appears unnecessary nowadays. Those were marvellous formalities with a lot of history behind them. But I think that from that point of view, the Pope wanted to streamline the conclave.
It's really extraordinary how in this media-conscious society, there's no way that the media can discover what's happening within the conclave. That hasn't changed at all.
That hasn't changed at all, and probably it's better that it shouldn't change, that the total confidentiality, the secrecy of the conclave should be maintained. What goes on inside the conclave, is nobody's business, shall we say. Only the cardinals know about it. And maybe that's the best way, that we don't see kind of partisan stands, people all going for this candidate or that candidate, someone possibly at the end scraping through with 2/3 majority or 2/3 plus one. Whoever emerges is the Pope. Each cardinal has his own desk in the Sistine Chapel, and normally they'll have 2 or 3 voting slips, rectangular pieces of paper with, in Latin, eligo in summum pontificem, and then the name that you want. I elect as Supreme Pontiff Cardinals, or just, it doesn't even say Cardinal, just the name that you've to add. Now that's at the top half of the piece of paper, of the rectangular slip. You're only allowed, obviously, to put in 1 ballot paper. So once you've completed your ballot paper with the name written clearly, but if possibly in a kind of disguised form of handwriting, you then fold it angularly so that it's now a long, thin slip of paper, and having completed the compilation of the ballots, the cardinals then proceed to deposit them in a special urn. They come in line of precedence, holding between their thumb and forefinger, holding so that it can be seen, the ballot paper which they have completed. Arriving at the chalice, they place the ballot paper on top of a paten and slip it that way. They don't put their hand into the urn, into the chalice. They slip this from the paten into the chalice, saying at the same time that they swear before God that this is the person whom they wish to elect as Pope. If someone, for instance, let's say has rheumatism and can't move from his place, that's taken care of. One of us will go and will take his ballot paper, compiled but closed, and again holding it aloft, will bring it and deposit it in the chalice as all the others have done. If somebody or others are so sick that they can't leave their own quarters in the Domus Sancti Marte, provision is made also for that. That's where the 3 infirmarians come into service. Now, at that stage, the balloting has taken place. The first of the scrutineers takes the great chalice and shakes it up so that all the ballot papers inside are all mixed up. He then empties it out onto the table, and at this stage the count begins. He takes a ballot paper, opens it, reads it, passes it only read to the second scrutineer, who reads the name, who passes it to the third, who reads the name and calls the name out aloud for all to hear, and then takes a needle and thread, and through the word eligo, through the word I elect, he passes the needle and thread through that word, and in that way the ballot papers will not be dispersed. It proceeds like that through all the ballot papers. Let's say that when they count the ballot papers at the beginning, that there's a discrepancy between the number of electors and the number of ballot papers, then immediately that's considered null. They've just got to start all over again. But let's presume that the right number is there and the right number of ballot papers are there, and they go through all that, announcing the name and taking the count. At the end of an inconclusive ballot, they will proceed to the second ballot, keeping on a side table all the original ballots from the first round. They'll go through the second ballot, and the same procedure, look at it, read it, announce it aloud, and thread it on to the other papers. And at the end of that, in an inconclusive ballot, they take all of these ballot papers, take them to the stove, push in some other, to be straw or something like that. I think they use chemicals now, though, that will produce dense black smoke. The important thing is that if it's only the papers that are being burned, then the smoke is white. Now, that only occurs when there has been a conclusive ballot. When going through the whole thing, they've realised the ballot papers tally with the electors. We've now got a candidate who has achieved 2/3 majority. This is also checked by the tellers, by revisers. They make sure that there's been no mistake made. And at that stage, all right, we're back to the stage where the dean asks the consent of the elected candidate.
And we never know anything. Okay.
No, strictly speaking, not. The reason being that the Camerlengo is supposed to collect, first of all, any other papers, any other notes that cardinals may have taken. They're supposed to hand them over, and they also are burned. Now, obviously, the scrutineers, they take full note, a very careful record of how the voting has gone. It's not that we lose all record, but those records are then put into a special envelope and put in a very specially assigned archive, not open to consultation.
What happens then?
You've now got a candidate who has been canonically elected. The Cardinal Dean asks him, do you accept your canonical election? And if he accepts it, the Dean asks him, by what name do you wish to be called? What name, pontifical name, do you wish to assume? And the newly elected Pope announces the name that he would like, to be called by. And from that very moment, he is the Bishop of Rome. He is the Pope. He's the head of the College of Bishops.
And we were listening there to a programme produced by Veronica Scaresbrick, who was interviewing Monsignor Charles Burns. He was the ecclesiastical advisor to the British Embassy to the Holy See. He also served as a canon of St. Peter's Basilica, and he continues to be active in Rome, although he's retired from his role in the Vatican archives after 35 years.
And here with us in studio this evening, we have Dr. Donald Prudlow, my friend from very way back. Dr. Prudlow is the Warren Studies at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma in the United States. Dr. Prudlow, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on this historic occasion.
And you have your academic field is history, and especially medieval history. And maybe tell us, the popes haven't always been elected through this very elaborate process of the conclave. Maybe you could say, to start us off with the original process for choosing the Bishop of Rome.
It's a very old institution. We're electing the 267th successor of St. Peter. And for the first millennium, the election was largely done by the clergy of Rome, and in very early days by an accession of the people of Rome together. But as time went on, two problems arose around the year 1000. And that was how to provide representation for a church that was rapidly growing throughout Europe and then throughout the world for this very important position. And the second is how to free papal elections from secular domination, from the domination of kings and princes and emperors, and how to make it secure as a religious office.
And that's where we saw the rise of the position of cardinal, which is not a biblical position, it's an ecclesiastical position, and it developed out of the clergy of Rome and still has a connection to the clergy of Rome.
Absolutely. It's critical that the cardinals can trace their lines back to the early, particularly the parishes of Rome, the deaconries of Rome, and that allows them, so when we saw last Sunday all of the cardinals going out to their titular parishes where they're pastors of and saying Mass there and meeting the people in those parishes, technically they are the pastor of that, and as a pastor they are entitled by ancient right to elect the Bishop of Rome. But notice what that does is, let's say a bishop from England or a bishop from Germany, from France, the Pope particularly wants them as an advisor, wants to give Germany, France, Italy, Spain a say in the election. He will appoint them as an advisor, a title that came to be assigned with cardinals, from cardines, the hinges of the Roman Church, the close associates of the Roman Church. And in this way, through the medieval process of representation was a very important principle in medieval Europe. The entire world has been given an opportunity, a say, in the election of the Roman Pontiff, which is itself such a position of worldwide import. And we saw cardinals today from all over the globe participating in that process.
In fact, that's something that was a particular focus for Pope Francis, who named a number of cardinals from countries that had never had a cardinal before and who now are participating in this conclave. Now, you mentioned, Don, that over the course of the centuries, and especially in what's sometimes known as the Dark Ages, there were problems with the papacy. There was influence from secular and other sources, and they started to begin the process of solidifying the election to ensure the absence of outside interference, also to ensure the spiritual import of the election. Can you talk to us a little bit about the development of the the first conclaves, and how it developed into the current process?
Absolutely. Since Rome is, in a certain sense, the central hub of the wheel of the Church, it's an important position. We know that. We saw the worldwide representation at Pope Francis's funeral, and we see what a significant power that this office can hold. And so that makes it important, that makes it interesting for secular rulers to try to interfere in the selection in order to get a candidate that might be more friendly to their political or earthly interests. And so starting in the 11th century with the purification of the papacy after a dark period, as you say, the election was reserved to the cardinals. And then in the 13th century, after a particularly difficult conclave, in fact, a conclave that lasted almost 3 years in the beautiful city of Viterbo, that resulted in the eventual election of Gregory the X, he decided that he was going to sequester the cardinals away, conclave, with a key, in a room, and keep them there until that they had reached their decision. And even this sometimes wasn't enough to get them to make up their minds. The city of Viterbo during that conclave actually put the cardinals on bread and water at one point, and even took the roof off the papal palace where they were meeting so they'd be exposed to the elements in order to, let us say, hasten a decision to get the church a pastor again. Gregory X issued a document called Ubi Periculum, which laid down many of the rules for the conclave that still applies today, described in the program we just heard and in the events that we just witnessed. Now, over the course of the years, that becomes solidified Particularly, we start to see when the papacy returns to Rome after the Avignon period, the conclave becomes much more settled. It starts to be held in the papal palace, in the Vatican, in the apostolic palace. Sometimes it'll go back to St. John Lateran, but most of the time starts to be held in 1492 in the Sistine Chapel, where it continues to be held to the present day. The last conclave that was outside the city of Rome was during the Napoleonic period in 1800. When all sorts of untoward things were happening around Europe, and so the papacy had to find a new way to make do.
Professor, you were just saying there that you noticed the cardinals from all over the world, and we think the whole world is watching us at this moment, not only Catholics. Don't you think so, Philippa, who we know is part of the Lutheran World Federation? You're here for the conclave. Your delegation will be here. What is your perspective on that?
Yes, thank you, Linda. It's good to be back in studio with you again, as we were back in 2013. And as you say, this historic election of a new pope is something that is of interest far beyond the Catholic world. You mentioned, of course, the great in the secular world, and I don't think we've ever seen quite so many journalists and media and people following the election and the funeral. They talk about this as the first election really of the social media era, and I think I'm absolutely amazed to see how many young people, my own children, people who have never really had that much interest in the intricate processes that you've been describing, what goes on behind those closed doors. Suddenly there is an explosion, a fascination for what goes on. I think the film Conclave, of course, has also had a lot to do with a little bit of an expert, having seen the film. I haven't seen the statistics myself, but I'm told that the numbers of downloads have skyrocketed since the death of Pope Francis. But coming back to your question, yes, I have always been particularly interested in the ecumenical aspects of these elections, having followed very closely the ecumenical scene under the pontificates of John Paul II, then Pope Benedict, and then, of course, Pope Francis. And yes, there is a very strong presence. At the funeral, there was some strong presence of ecumenical delegates attending the funeral in St. Peter's Square, and there will be again at the installation of the new Pope once we know who he is.
Right now we're watching images of the square, and we've just been seeing a lot of media out there with their cameras, and I think we have Devon on the line now. He is in the square. We go to him if the blockers are not working right now. Devon?
Hi, Linda. How are you?
There you are. Great.
I'm here.
Good.
Yes, it's really wonderful here. As you can see on the screen, the sun is going down behind St. Peter's Basilica, and the square is really filling up. It's not completely full yet. There's still space, if anybody's curious, but it's filling up, and there's kind of you get a sense of a calm curiosity. There's not a big excitement. It's really calm. Everybody is just waiting to see what's going to happen here in a little bit.
We know that Romans traditionally flock to the square once they see the white smoke. I don't want to make any previsioni, as we say here in Rome, forecasts. We're not really expecting white smoke in this first session, but you never know. People are there to wait for the smoke. I understand you also spoke to a few of the people in the square, and we will be playing some of those clips in a while. Meanwhile, anything relevant that they have been telling you that you think might be interesting?
Yes, what I would say is that this is kind of what I feel here is kind of a cross-section of society and the church as a whole. There are people from around the world. I just spoke to a deacon who's studying at the Gregorian from Tanzania. There was a couple of young ladies who live here in Italy, in southern Italy. They've come up for the conclave, make sure that their trains coincided with their visits to Rome and with the conclave. And so there are other people. You can see a myriad of colors, of flags are out here, people wearing everything under the sun. It's a beautiful day out here. It rained earlier this morning. Everyone kind of worried it was going to be raining, but it's a beautiful afternoon, and the sky is really cleared up. And you feel that that tension, that excitement of curiosity and hope. And so what the people I was speaking to were saying was that their hopes for the future of the church are that we continue united and that we go together, and that the hope leads us in this new direction.
Thank you very much, Devon, for bringing us live a bit of excitement from the square. We continue to watch the images, the Roman seagulls sitting next to the famous chimney right there. Back to Philippa and to Professor Prudlow here in studio. We have so much to talk about. Perhaps, Philippa, looking a little bit at what Pope Francis's legacy has brought us as regards the Church's ecumenical path forward. What are you looking towards? What do you hope the next Pope may be able to build on that legacy?
As you say, there is, or as we were saying earlier, there is a lot of expectation from other Christian churches and other Christian leaders, looking back with immense gratitude to the legacy of Pope Francis. If I can just remember back to the conclave in 2013 and to his election, that announcement, which took a lot of people by surprise. Bergoglio wasn't one of the top names that people were expecting, but I can never forget that moment that he stepped out onto the balcony describing himself as the Bishop of Rome, and the effect that had on some of the ecumenical guests, some of the other leaders who were listening to his words, and hearing a new openness that in fact continued to be the path that he followed throughout the 12 years of his pontificate. You know, this was a man who talked about how his door was always open, and that included not just everybody, people of all different churches and of course different faiths and no faith at all. And so there were some extremely significant events that I was very privileged to be part of. I think particularly of the Lutheran World Federation and Pope Francis marking together the 500th anniversary. I remember when I first heard about the possibility of that happening, saying to colleagues around Rome, you know...
Yes, you were here at the radio back then.
Absolutely, and I remember saying the Pope is going to mark the anniversary, the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, together with the Lutherans, and people saying, you're daydreaming, that's never going to happen. But of course, the Pope travelled to Sweden, and together with the Lutheran World Federation leadership, he had a very significant liturgy in Lund Cathedral, and then went on to the stadium in Malmö, where together they looked to the past, they asked forgiveness for the sins, the divisions, the terrible sins that came out of the divisions of the Reformation, and then pledged to overcome that by working together into the future. And I think that was one of the very significant events that I was privileged to be part of, and of course, as you say, now continuing to work in that vein with the Lutheran World Federation.
He also brought other changes in all aspects. Today, Professor Prudlow, you are very knowledgeable of things past, but you're also an observer of current affairs. What would you say some of the most, say, interesting to the general public changes have been as regards liturgy, as regards ceremony, and all these things that we are witnessing right now?
Well, I really agree with what Philippa said about this being very much on social media and very much open to the world. And so people seeing some of these very ancient things for the first time and being quite impressed by them and wanting to know more because in previous times these conclaves would happen so far away from people's minds before the age of news telegraphs and things like that. You might be informed a year or so later that you had a new pope and you had to change the name in the liturgy. So this is a great opportunity for outreach for the Catholic Church, for sure. One thing that's changed in the last 150 years is conclaves have gotten so much shorter. Conclaves used to be 50, 60, 70, 100. There was the one conclave that was 181 days, and it was recently in the 18th century. And I think that's come about as a result of increased communication. Cardinals are able to know each other more. We know more about what's going on in the world more immediately. And so those have come down as well. And I think cardinals today are sensitive to the idea that perhaps a long conclave might not be very adaptable for the modern media that would lead to all sorts of problems. So a lot of things get worked out. But you have elections as the church opens to the world. In 1903, you have the first non-European elector, Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore. But then you start to run into problems. How is the church going to manage to get those cardinals from so far away? And in 1914, 1922, the conclave happened so quickly, the American and Canadian cardinals weren't able to be there. And so that's when they added the 15-day rule, which now with the advent of air travel, right, becomes a little easier. But now that, as Kristen, you were saying, that cardinals coming from all over the world, from Tonga, from Burma, from Mongolia, the flights aren't as regular, and so they need to have more time to make sure.
Some of them only just arrived 2 days ago.
Yes,
the last
can you imagine that?
Yes.
Right, just being dropped into the middle of this from your country. And that's astonishing. We talked also about secular interference in elections, and people think, well, that was a Middle Ages problem. And in fact, the European monarchs, the Catholic European monarchs, all through the 17th, 18th, 19th century, had the right to veto candidates. And as recently as 1903, the Austro-Hungarian emperor excluded a candidate, which led, of course, to the election of St. Pius X, which was a sort of good outcome. And he himself abolished what was called the jus exclusive, the right of European monarchs to object to particular candidates. And so that, and then we see other changes in 1971. 81-year-olds and above were disallowed from participation in the conclave. But we saw how healthy their contributions were in the general congregations in the events leading up to the conclave. So there have been a lot of times in church history where the conclave and the cardinalate is one of those adaptations that the church has made through history in order to meet these challenging demands that have come up over these 2,000 years.
And I think, too, talking about the changes in the conclave, we've seen how a change originally to accommodate cardinals who are coming from far away, this long period between the death of a pope and the entrance into the conclave, has changed in its purpose. 100 years ago, that was to make sure someone could jump on a boat and get from South America or even Australia now and make it to Rome in time for the conclave. A lot of talk in the past couple of weeks about cardinals having an opportunity to get to know one another. Even though they can see one another in the papers, in the media, they can talk to one another on the phone, but to have the real experience of being here in Rome, in person, and I think that's something that Pope Francis would have said too, speaking about the importance of relationships and getting to know someone personally. And so that is a change that originally had one purpose in the church and has subsequently had a new purpose. Even something like excluding interference, what that looked like 500 years ago when, Henry VIII was King of England, and what that looks like now when you have dictatorships, you have governments that are run on X or TikTok, and the purpose of excluding people from the conclave started with one end in mind, and the church has adapted that, and it still serves a purpose, even if that's not what was originally foreseen by the people who implemented that change in the system.
But it's all stayed incredibly secret. We know that yesterday everyone who is participating in the proceedings, and that's not only the cardinals who are voting, but obviously they're medics, there are people making meals, they're the cleaners, they're the florists. Oath of secrecy yesterday, swearing that not a single thing they're going to be hearing in these days would be leaked out. I know that there are a couple of walkie-talkies that can be used in an emergency if they need to call a medic, but their cell phones have been taken away, they can't read the papers, they don't watch television, there is no radio. So yes, it really is.
It may depend on how long they can go without cell phones.
Well, and it's interesting too. You started to allude to this. There are several officials among the cardinals who do have the right and the means to communicate outside of the conclaves. So, for instance, suppose many of the cardinals are very old. Suppose one of them gets sick and they need to call a doctor. There's a procedure for that. I don't expect them to run out of food, but if it does go to a long conclave, they can make arrangements for that. Or perhaps a more spectacular outcome, if the cardinal should choose to elect someone who is not in conclave. And there has to be a means of contacting them, which would be, I think, shocking to the whole world. But Don, it wouldn't be the first time that they've chosen someone who is not in the room, or not even a cardinal.
That is absolutely possible. One of the most famous examples was after the long conclave of 1292 to 1294, where they were in an absolute deadlock for 3 years, and they just could not, and nobody would back down. And finally, they broke down and said, I heard that there's this hermit living up on this mountain. He's a very holy guy. Maybe just making a holy person pope. Let's try that. And so you have this picture of these bishops and cardinals trundling up this mountain in Abruzzi, and getting to this hermit's cave to tell him that he's just been elected as pope. And he tried to prostrate before them, and they tried to prostrate before him, and it was all very awkward. But to have something like that happen, it's been a very long time since anyone who was not a bishop has been nominated. That was Gregory the 16th in 1831. And so if somebody who's not a bishop is elected, they do not assume the office of pope until they're made a bishop. You have to be a bishop to be the Bishop of Rome.
I imagine there's some prerequisites to be named, even if you're not a cardinal.
I find it interesting. So if you're a baptized unordained Catholic male and you get the call, like I've told my wife to stay by the phone just in case, that you would have to have your wife's permission in order to do that, because you'd have to separate from bed and board to be ordained. But that is a theoretical, if remote, possibility.
Basically, the only requirement is that you are the requirements for being made a bishop,
yes. Which
technically is, if you were to choose someone, and Don, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are stories of people who've been elected even before they've been baptized, and they went through the process of baptism, ordination, consecration to the bishopric. I think some of those are maybe not certain. But
we know for sure St. Ambrose of Milan, who was the Roman civil administrator, who was so skillful at getting various parties of Christians to get to talk to one another. He was
even though he himself was a pagan.
He himself was a pagan, and both sides, the Arians and the Catholics, shouted out Ambrose Bishop, and they carried him into the cathedral. He was baptized. He went through the 7 grades of ordination, and on the 8th day, he was made the Bishop of Milan. And so there are examples.
Something like the very holy hermit who was elected to the. He did not last very long. And eventually, how did he tell us about how his papacy ended?
Peter Celestine, who later became Saint Celestine, was an exceptionally holy man. But what his tenure demonstrates is that holiness does not necessarily confer administrative skill. And so it's possible for someone to be quite a holy person and be a worldly failure, particularly in positions of leadership. And so nature needs to build on grace to pick someone, for the cardinals to pick someone who does have this kind of ability to have this world-changing position. It's such a position of responsibility that there are certain skills that are necessary, and to that must be added the grace of God in order to govern the church. But that's so he resigned after 6 months, and we talked a lot about that in 2013. You'll recall when Pope Benedict resigned, as being one of the last instances where a pope left the office. But so he still remained a saint, and the church went in a different direction after him.
And in fact, Benedict the 16th, which people saw after the fact as maybe son, went to visit the tomb of the relics of Pope Saint Celestine V. Philippa, you were here with us, and I'm sure you remember the day that the Pope Benedict announced his resignation. Can you tell us about that?
It was a pretty extraordinary moment. There was an Italian journalist, a colleague you may remember, who was following a very ordinary consistory in the Vatican. The proceedings were in Latin. Nobody else was listening. It was a routine run-of-the-mill Vatican event, and we were all going to write a few lines on it afterwards. And then suddenly, as she was listening to what the Pope is saying, she's thinking, what am I hearing? And she says, the Pope's announced his resignation, and of course everybody laughed because such a thing hadn't happened, as you say, for centuries. But of course she was right, and the news spread like wildfire. I remember I was in the office here when one of the Italian colleagues came in and announced the Pope had resigned, and just a look of shock and not quite knowing what to do next, actually. And then we began, of course, going back through. The first reaction was, well, let's start looking back through the things that he's been saying. I remember I was asked to look at some of the first things that he'd said in the days after his election, and it was fascinating to look back on, I think it was the first or the second day, when he was talking about not being up to the challenge in a certain sense, but with God's will he would do what he could do to take on this extraordinarily difficult role. I think it's difficult for us now to perhaps remember back to just how deep a crisis the Church was facing during those final years of the Benedict. You know, there was the financial crisis, there was the sex abuse crisis, which was at its peak. Time there were the so-called Vati leaks. With it was really a time of extreme difficulty on so very many fronts. And again, looking back to those first speeches that Pope Benedict made, he was really very aware. He talked about it, in fact, if you remember, in the meetings ahead of that conclave, he talked about the need to clear up the filth that was inside the Church. And he was probably more than anybody else aware of just what a daunting task that would be. And at his age, in his not young state, the energy that was needed to take on a task like that. And so it was fascinating to look back and to realize just and to ask actually just when this decision of his to resign would have been made. I happen to know that the former Archbishop, well, at least there's two former Archbishop of Canterbury's now, but Rowan Williams, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Anglican leader at that time, had a conversation with Benedict a year before the resignation was announced, and the two of them, Rowan Williams was looking forward to his own stepping down and being able to have more time to do the things that he wanted to do, to study and to read and to write and so on. And he told me that he and Benedict had been able to discuss that, and clearly Benedict had been maturing this decision for a very long time. So it was, yes, an extraordinary surprise for us, requiring unprecedented ways of working, and but for Benedict, I think it had been a decision that he'd been maturing for some time, of course.
And you talk about the crises that faced the Church in 2013 and those last couple of years of Benedict's reign that really came to a head at that time and had an impact on the papacy of Pope Francis. He spoke very forcefully about the plague or the scourge of abuse. He dealt with his own not his own scandals, but the scandals of finances that we've seen in the past few years. We've had very public trials, even of cardinals, harkening back perhaps to the past. But maybe you could talk about your thoughts, if we could ask our guests about some of the attempts that Pope Francis has made to continue the efforts to reform the Church. I'll open the mic to either one of you.
I mean, I would say the whole process of synodality is something which, I mean, this really to me is Francis's legacy, and it has implications on the ecumenical and the interfaith work that I'm so very interested in, but it has enormous implications throughout the Catholic world as well. The process of trying to open up the Church, to make it more participatory, to make it something that people can join in sort of contributing to what should be the direction that the Church is taking, to let people's voices be heard. And this opening up, of course, is shaking up all the traditional sort of institutional practices that we're used to. And in a sense, I think this is probably where his main focus was. But as you rightly say, at the same time, he's dealing with all the internal affairs of the Church, the problems with the financial situation, which remains extremely challenging. The sexual abuse crisis, I would say, is improved, significantly improved over the past decade. You know, so many churches have in place their safeguarding measures, the Vatican itself has made steps ahead with the safeguarding, with the commission that's working on that. But of course, challenges remain, and this is something which I've no doubt the cardinals have been discussing over these past days in their general congregations, and trying to focus on what are the key problems and what kind of person has the right skills to deal with these challenges at this particular moment in time.
And Don, a lot of the talk in the past year has been about synodality in the last 2 years, asking for the voice of the faithful. You're a practicing Catholic in the United States. What's your perspective on challenges that have arisen from these really scandalous problems that have affected the church at large?
Right, the public witness of the church has been very much affected. The ability for bishops and priests to speak with moral credibility has been weakened, and that's something that's going to take a long time to build. It's going to need not only a personal witness of holiness, but also institutions and procedures that are going to be effective in safeguarding. And it's going to take, particularly people listening to victims as well. I think this is something that I remember Benedict was so good with as well. Is that and Francis did when he visited too. That the sort of personal witness of listening to those who have been hurt, and incorporating their thoughts and their ideas on how to prevent things from happening in the future. But this is and then you have the internal issues. You have internal issues, financial issues, Vatican finances. You have issues with various levels of corruption, and this is also not a new problem. I mean, if you go back through history, popes have been dealing with things like this since the very dawn of Christianity, and we can, by looking back at our history, we can see how people like Pope St. Damasus or Pope St. Leo or Pope St. Gregory handled these things, because Pope St. Leo the Great had to depose 6 bishops for corruption and violations of their vows, and so this is nothing new, and so to put it into a historical context is also a significant way to work through it as well.
Meanwhile, I'm looking at the square. There's an incredible sunset. Rome is so beautiful, the Bernini colonnade. We have a couple of clips that Devon collected for us in the square, just short up with him. I think the first one is a deacon from Tanzania. Can we hear him, Francesca?
So what brings you out to St. Peter's Square today?
We are here because of the conclave. We know that our cardinals, they are in conclave, so our presence here is to pray and to join with the other Christian, other Catholic, to pray for the Holy Spirit, so that the whole process for electing Papa will be guided by the Holy Spirit.
What are your hopes for the church, the future of the church?
We are in the year of hope, so I hope that the God will give us the Pope who will guide the church according to the sign of the time, who will guide the people of God in the holiness as a good pastor of the church.
And what would you wish for the new Pope?
For myself, I don't have any wish. My role is to pray. For me, for anyone, because any cardinal who entered in the conclave, they have possibility to electing to be a pope. So wherever I come from, Africa, Asia, America, what we need the Holy Pope. Well, we don't need the Pope from according to the color, according to the region, according to anywhere. But what we need the whole Pope. We need the Pope which will guide the church and will be the pastor of the church.
That was so nice. We don't need the color, we don't need the region, we need the whole Pope. He put that beautifully. Let's listen to pilgrims, ordinary pilgrims that were in the square today.
Could I get your name, please?
Sure. Susan Duenas.
So what are you doing in Rome?
We're here to watch the first night of the conclave.
Did you come specifically for this?
We did. I live in Naples, and we made a special trip up here just for this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
So what's your hope for the future of the church and for the new Pope?
For unification and to continue to grow the church and bring more people back to the faith.
So where are you coming in from, America?
My husband is stationed in Naples, but we're from the United States.
Is this your first conclave?
This is my first conclave, my first live one.
Do you remember where you were at the last one?
I don't remember where I was at the last one, but I remember exactly where I was for Pope Benedict. I was in college in my room, in my dorm room, watching what we could see.
What are you feeling when you're here? You hoping it'll be tonight?
Oh, I mean, it would be great if it was tonight, but I'm just here to experience and to hope to see some smoke, and mostly praying that God leads whoever the right future pope is.
If I could get your name, please?
Sarah Stefanski.
So what are you here for?
Here visiting family, and we came in for the first day of the conclave.
And so was it just by chance that you made it here?
We took a train in from Naples. The trip was already planned, but once we found out the day, we made sure we were coming.
How many days do you think it will be?
I think it'll be 5.
5? Wow, okay. Are you going to come out for every day?
No, unfortunately, this is the only day we could make work with our schedule.
So what are your hopes for the future of the church?
I just hope we are united and come together under a new pope who can lead us all for more peace and love around the world.
And we heard a couple of people talking about the possibility of an election this evening. Linda, I think you summed it up well. I think everybody would be very surprised to see an election on the very first ballot on the first night. But we have had some remarkably short conclaves in the past. Don, you want to share some of those with us?
Even recently, both Pope Francis and Pope Benedict were elected very quickly on the second day. And but Pius XII was the same way. Sometimes people go in and the momentum is so high that within a few ballots, it is rather unlikely that we will get a pope on the first ballot. The first ballot usually is in conclaves for the cardinals to test out strength. Sometimes they offer sort of honorific votes. I know in the past, in the early 20th century, was often used as an occasion for non-Italian popes. Non-Italian electors to write in non-Italian names, just to establish the precedent that it didn't have to be an Italian on the first day. And it won't be like Pope Julius II, who was elected within a few hours of the conclave starting. But there always is 1334 when the main candidate wouldn't agree to the cardinals' demands. They didn't know what to do, and so they held a ballot, and everyone chose the least likely candidate that they possibly could. Jacques Fournier, who became Benedict XII, was a very good pope that nobody had expected, and he was elected on the first ballot. So it can happen, but it is really quite a very rare experience.
I think it's very interesting to hear and to look back and to uncover what we know about the process of voting, how it happens. We discovered, for example, didn't we, that Francis had been quite a potential contender during the previous election in 2005, but then for the sake of unity, we were told that he stepped back so that Benedict could in fact garner that 2/3 majority that he needed to take over from Pope John Paul II. I was really struck just now listening to the voices of the people in the square, ordinary people. Every single one of them almost is talking about unity, the need for unity. And I think this question of how long the conclave goes on for is seen very much as an important signal regarding the unity of the church, because the longer it goes on for, clearly the cardinals are unable to decide on the kind of man they want to lead the church. And therefore, I think there's a certain pressure mounting day by day, or vote by vote even, to try and show, in a particularly polarized world that we're living in at the moment, where people are so deeply divided, to have a real show of unity on the part of the church leaders. I think that's going to be weighing most heavily on a lot of those cardinals' minds at the moment.
And Philippa, you have a strong focus on ecumenism, and as a member of the Church of England, you've done a lot of work with the question of Christian unity. The Pope, from the Catholic point of view, is, of course, the center of unity, and that's been the focus of a lot of ecumenical discussions. How does that play out in the overarching Christian world, as the Pope intended to be a center of unity, but also a focus of contention with the relationships between Catholic and non-Catholic communities.
Well, I mentioned earlier the moment that Pope Francis came out onto the balcony describing himself as the Bishop of Rome, and what a strong signal that was to other Christian leaders about his role, not trying to describe himself as Supreme Pontiff or use some of these other titles that can be quite alienating, but describe himself the primus inter pares, in a sense, the first among equals of the bishops, and therefore this title Bishop of Rome was very significant, together with the other kind of signals that he gave early on in his pontificate. And yes, of course, the question of the papacy is a crucial, it's the crux of the matter in many of these ecumenical dialogues. The Orthodox dialogues are discussing the role of the Pope in the first millennium and in the second millennium, and it's also, very much the discussion that's going on in the other the churches of the Reformation. The dialogues there are also discussing the role of the Pope, and that's why I think Francis's legacy is so significant, because he made very important overtures about the way that he could work together with other Christian leaders. But of course we can't forget the encyclical Ut Unum Sint from Pope John Paul II back in, I think it was 1995, when he actually asked other Christian leaders to come forward with ideas, to make proposals as to how the role of the papacy could be acceptable to other churches, to other Christian communions. And this is still very much a work that's ongoing. It sort of fell a little bit by the wayside during the previous decade or two, but it's very much front and centre again. And I think I think we're going to see over the coming months, again, some responses to that. The Council, or the Dicastery as it now is for Christian Unity, has gathered together some of these responses, and we've seen the publication of a book bringing together a lot of these responses. So it's very much at the heart, as you say, of the conversations and at the heart of the dialogues with other Christian churches. So very important to see what direction the new Pope will take on this, and whether he will prioritize this as an important issue, because of course the division of the churches is one of the biggest scandals of the Christian world. It's so much easier for when people see unity, when people see united churches, to be able to make a commitment to that.
Thank you, Philippa. We've been talking with Philippa Hitchin, Don Prudlow, our guests, as we enter into this first hour of and waiting for the election of the new Pope. If you've just joined us, earlier this evening we saw the Cardinals enter into conclave, and now everybody, I think, kind of around the world is waiting to see the smoke rising from the Sistine Chapel. If you are just joining us, I'd like to offer you a very warm welcome. Also, a thank you to all of our television partners and radio partners, especially TV, Catholic Faith Network in America, Shalom World Television's Network USA, at Madarshan TV, Catholic TV, Madha TV India, and UCTV, Uganda Catholic Television. Also radio partners Luminous Radio and Radio Katipunan in the Philippines. Welcome to all of you. My name is Christopher Wells, and I'm joined here with my colleague Linda Bordoni, and our guests.
Our most prestigious guests, Philippa Hitchin and Professor Prudlow. But I do suggest a tiny musical break as we continue to watch the sunset. So here we are on air as we await the smoke that will chug out of the chimney on the Sistine Chapel. We all remember, or more than remember, we're not that old, but we do. We have all read about the famous conclave in 1958 when John the 23rd was elected. The cardinals convened on, I think it was the 26th of October, and immediately white smoke was seen to appear out of the chimney, and obviously the crowd erupted in applause, only to discover that the burning process wasn't as they thought it should be, and it soon turned black. And unfortunately, it happened this next day as well, exactly the same thing. And finally, on the third day, he was actually elected on the 28th of October after 2 false alarms. It really was white smoke. I think the people were probably a bit wary at that time, but yes, the smoke is incredibly magnetizing, isn't it, as we watch that chimney.
Definitely have very strong memories of a former colleague here at Vatican Radio doing some coverage for the election. I believe it was for John Paul II, and I remember him talking about the dirty grey smoke, a Scotsman talking about the dirty grey smoke, and he wasn't quite sure whether it was white or whether it was black. And quite often at the beginning, I mean, I do remember the previous 2 that I have covered, I remember that it is a little bit difficult at the beginning to see. It starts off quite slowly and then it seems to kind of gain momentum. And I think there's been some work on the kind of chemical processes, hasn't there? Maybe somebody else knows a bit more about
They did begin to use the chemicals for both the white and the black.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you're right about the evocative power of the smoke. This has become sort of a symbol, and now the webcam, people will put webcams on at home, and I saw that we have some real enthusiasts, because 12 hours before I saw there was a chimney webcam before they'd even gone into conclave with 11,000 visitors, 11,000 watching currently. So people are really transfixed by this. But it was a good addition, I think it was 2013 when Benedict, because of the confusion about this, that when there's white smoke, the bells of St. Peter's will peal out as well. Right. So that will be a confirmatory. And it's also an issue in winter conclaves, right? Because it's night and it's very difficult to see the color of the smoke at night. And so those bells were a good addition.
Although I remember it took quite a while for the bells to actually start pealing. So the people were cheering wildly in the square, and it was only quite a significant time after that the bells actually confirmed that.
In fact, I remember that conclave as well. I think we all remember that very clearly. And yes, that's exactly right, because even with the addition of the chemicals, the smoke wasn't clear. You talked about it, Philippa. When the smoke first comes out, first you've got people asking, well, is smoke coming out? Is that a cloud? Is that really what it is? And then it becomes a little bit more definitely smoke coming out of the chimney. And then you say, well, it looks kind of gray, it looks kind of white. And they had told us here in the studio that they were going to ring the bells as soon as the smoke came out. And I think for the first election in decades, we had smoke that was pretty clearly white, but then the bells didn't ring the way they were supposed to for a long while.
And this happens, right? I mean, you remember when Benedict was elected and Cardinal Medina came out, and as soon as he said Habemus Papam, the band started playing. And he had to wait for about 15, 20 seconds, and it was very awkward. But so we saw the beautiful, magnificent liturgical choreography today, that this is still an event that's run by human beings, and sometimes that these things can happen, and they lend a lot of great color to the history.
Well, we're on the subject of the smoke coming out of the chimney. The other lasting memory I have of these conclaves, and watching the screen again today, is the seagulls. The seagulls who seem to be magnetically drawn to that chimney, possibly because of the warmth that comes out of it. But I do remember during the 2013 conclave sitting in studio, just as we are today, discussing ecumenical interfaith legacies of Pope Benedict, looking at the characteristics of the new man, what would be required. And I remember the producer at that time saying to me, talk about the seagull. You know, the seagull has its own hashtag. The seagull is trending on Twitter. And it's just quite fascinating how people take different aspects of these, as you say, very traditional, very historical events, and yet give them a particularly modern twist. I find that fascinating.
I heard the other day that, in fact, inside the Sistine Chapel, there are 2 ovens. And that's because in the one oven, they burn the ballots. In the other oven, they actually put the chemicals you were talking about, Professor Prudlow, which are the ones that will produce the right coloured smoke.
We hope.
We hope, yes. There was one when they were still trying to. They were testing it. When were they? Do you remember when they were testing the chemicals in 2005 before the conclave? And they just the air, it just turned black. I mean, the entire sky above the Vatican was just black with smoke because they'd put in way too much of the chemical at that time.
But I think it's interesting again how we've seen a lot of pictures recently, as you say, these two ovens in the Sistine Chapel before, this veil of secrecy that on the one hand was so fascinating to people outside the confines of the Vatican, but on the other hand, people are equally fascinated now they can see the process. We saw the workmen going in with the scaffolding and putting up the chimney and putting the ovens into place, and I think that's been very...
Yeah, there's a beautiful video on Vatican News that shows the room of tears, which is the room where the Pope will receive his vestments and cry.
And have some time for prayer and crying. That is the responsibility.
After he has accepted the what would we call it, the proclamation, because the cardinals ask the Pope whether he accepts or not, and
he can say no.
He can say no, right? Anyway, please go and look at our video because it shows that room of tears. It shows the 3 different sized vestments that have been made to fit whoever is elected. It shows...
after it was a little tight on Pope John the 23rd, they knew they had to have a range of sizes for the possible
But interestingly,
Pope.
Linda, you were telling me that the traditional papal tailors that has been producing these vestments for so many decades, apparently there's been a change.
Yes, there has been a change. So we all knew Gamarelli. I think we all bought socks at Gamarelli, the cardinal socks. This year it's Mancinelli, who apparently makes a bit of a more... a lighter textile, better for transpiration, more comfortable. So
we talked about all of the people inside the Vatican who help with the conclave. One of the people that's there is a tailor on hand. They have a small, medium, and large cassock, but they have someone right there so that when he puts it on, they can make adjustments so it's not overflowing, it's not too tight. They've got some room to breathe, so to speak. In the legend about John the 23rd, who was a portly Italian, famously from peasant stock, as they say, in Italy, and the story was that when he put on the extra large white cassock, it still wasn't big enough, and they had to open up the back of it and kind of tie it together like a hospital gown, obviously with his regular clothes underneath. But there's some of the stories that we hear from the conclaves.
I noticed that hanging in the room of tears is the little red cape, which Pope Francis did not wear.
He chose not to wear.
He chose not to wear.
Yeah,
why did he choose not to wear that red cape?
It was a gesture of he meant it as a gesture of humility, in the sense that he wanted to be seen as Francis, as Bishop of Rome, in a simplicity. But I don't think that there should be any judgment if the new Pope chooses to wear it. I mean, it's the proper garment for that moment. There's nothing hieratic. It's just a particular garment for the papacy. And but when you say the tailors and those great videos that you had, it should remind us of the hundreds of people that work to put this together behind the scenes, all the Vaticanisti, all the people that work that they are so hard to make these things come off, the infirmarians, the people that prepare the food, and the people that prepared the conclave, the choir, the masters of ceremonies. It's really
it's a big production.
It's an amazing production and it's an irregular production, right? I mean, I think of in England, right, trying to practice a coronation after over 6 decades, and it's sort of the same thing here. You don't know when it's going to happen. You start to think about it. People come, people go, and there's books, but it's one thing to reduce a book to actual practice. And now that we have videos and things like that, it's so good to record those things and to help people to remember how difficult it is.
And we weren't working in those days back in the 1970s, but I wonder what it must have been like to have had 2 of them in very, very close succession within days.
33 days.
Was the length of the papacy, and so then
Of John Paul
the period
I.
after that when they elected the John Paul II.
So barely the entire Vatican staff barely had time to get to relax and to recover from one, and then they're doing it all over again. It must have been an extraordinary moment.
It was very interesting. I come from a very small diocese in the United States, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which very few people perhaps have ever heard of. But one of our claims to fame, my former bishop was one of the very, very few bishops appointed by Pope John Paul I. So one of the very few people in the whole church who was the subject of an act of the month-long papacy of John Paul I. And I think a lot of us will have stories about our interactions with popes, not just the people who work here, but people throughout the world who come and see the popes. Do you have some memories of the popes that you've experienced through your time?
Well, Pope Francis memorably invited all the Vatican staff. As far as I know, it was the first time for something like this, but he invited all of us to join him for the masses that he instigated in the Santa Marta Chapel, where he chose to live rather than in the Apostolic Palace. And he began the tradition of giving a sermon every morning in the Santa Marta Chapel, and we were all invited to go along. So I think it was maybe a month or two after his inauguration, the inauguration of his papacy, that I was able to go along, and that to me was an extraordinary moment. The previous time that I'd seen him was just after I think it was 3 or 4 days after the papacy, the inauguration, or the election rather, when he was in all the journalists in the Paul VI Hall. You were there too, weren't you? And he announced why he had chosen the name Francis. He wanted to be to honour the name of Francis as a man of peace, a man of poverty, and a man of protection of creation. And these were, of course, 3 themes that he would develop so strongly throughout his pontificate. And that was, again, an extraordinary moment.
It was extraordinary also that he called the journalists to thank them for the work they had done during such an intense period. It was, we didn't realize how moving that gratitude would be. I can't but help think of his very last audience, public audience, was to thank the medics, the doctors and the staff at the hospital who had taken care of him.
The other thing I remember about that audience with the journalists at the beginning was the way that he said, I'm going to bless you, but I'm going to do it in silence because many of you are non-believers or not share of the Catholic faith. And so there was immediately this great sense of openness and a great sense of respect for people who didn't necessarily belong to the Catholic Church. And all these signs at the beginning were just so very encouraging to people who'd somehow been feeling a little bit excluded or hadn't been given the same kind of welcome in the past. So these were very strong memories for me. And the Santa Marta was my opportunity to mention to him my interest in ecumenism and how I was at that time the warden of All Saints Church, Anglican Church here in Rome. And another important memory for me in that sense was that in 2016 I was able to welcome him because he became the first Pope to visit the Anglican Church in his own diocese of Rome. Of course, popes had visited Anglican churches before, notably John Paul II in 1982 became the first Pope to travel to England since the Reformation, and going into Canterbury Cathedral. Of course, there have been many papal visits to Anglican churches, but for the Pope to come to the Anglican Church in his own diocese was an extraordinary moment, and it was marking the 200th anniversary of our community here in Rome. And he came and gave had a great conversation with people. It was a beautiful liturgy, and it was on that occasion, if I'm not mistaken, he announced he intended to visit South Sudan together with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the Church of Scotland. That hadn't been. There was a bit of an uproar because it hadn't been officially announced by the Vatican, but he announced he intended to go anyway, which was typical of the Francis style, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Do you have memories memories?
Well, yes, it's funny that all four of us were at that journalist audience. That was an enjoyable day. But he joked that day too. Remember when he joked about his papal name, about how whether I may have gone with Adrian the Seventh, as the great reformer, but he didn't live very long. So, and then he said, well, I could have taken Clement, the Pope that suppressed the Jesuits, and so that got everybody loosened up, and I thought that was a really charming way. But I do also remember a moment with Pope Benedict. It was a strange one. We were in Valle d'Aosta after we'd been in Rome for a while, so we were away from Roman things, and we were driving through town, and it was there's traffic. I was like, this is like Roman traffic. I mean, why is there so much traffic up in this little corner of Italy? And I turned my head, and right next to me was Pope Benedict. He'd just been taken to the hospital after he'd broken his arm when he was on vacation there. And so he was right next to me and my family in the car, like going the other way on the street stop.
Did you wave?
We waved, yes.
So we're looking at the screen here. We're looking at the square, getting close to what could be a time for smoke. What do you think?
Well, we're expecting the vote to take place shortly after the Cardinals went into conclave, the first vote this evening. But as a lot of people have noted, it's pretty well known, this is the largest group of cardinals ever to enter into conclave, 133. If you watch the broadcast of the entrance, it takes a little while for 133 mostly elderly cardinals to get up, to cast their vote, for the votes to be counted. We heard Monsignor Burns' very excellent elaboration of that process. So we're not sure how long it takes, and I think that's a challenge for all of us, but also for the people coming in the square. If you were watching at the beginning of the broadcast, the square was not empty, but there weren't a whole lot of people there, and they've been filtering in.
It's really filled up.
It's really filled up. I think we all remember previous conclaves when the white smoke comes out, everybody in Rome is going to be coming to St. Peter's Square. But just to talk a little bit about the process this evening, we are expecting a vote perhaps around 7:30 in about 10 minutes, but there's no precise timing. So it could be any time, and we will have people watching for that first wisp of smoke and then to try and determine what color it is. And Phil, Linda, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we can expect for the next couple of days in terms of looking for the smoke and the outcome of the different votes in the Sistine Chapel.
Well, the one interesting thing I've just discovered is, as you were saying, there are two separate votes.
Ovens, yeah.
Okay.
Well, just one on the first day, right?
Just one on the first day, but as from tomorrow morning, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. So should the smoke arise in the middle of one of those sessions, it'll be white for sure.
That's right. Yes.
Right?
That's because if they go immediately to a second vote if it's a failed vote, and so that means we won't get smoke until around noon. If it's
even
a failed
later,
vote.
in fact, I think we're expecting around 1 o'clock.
Around 1. So if we do absolutely right, if we get it at 11:30, 10:30, 11, it will be white smoke. Yeah.
I heard an interesting little detail. You were talking about people rushing from around Rome. When people hear the news, they tend to gather in the square to see who the new pope will be. I read a lovely detail from the English College, the Venerable English College, where the seminarians from the UK trained to become priests. And there was obviously a question about were they allowed to run out of their classes if they heard news of course, all of them will have their cell phones, I imagine, so they'll get news almost within seconds of it happening. And apparently there has been a ruling from the college that seminarians are allowed to get up in the middle of classes, go and congregate in the square to acclaim the new pope if and when it happens during the day.
I remember I was a student at the Angelicum during the election of Pope Benedict in 2005, and that same question came up. Of course, John Paul had been pope for almost 27 years, so a conclave was a new thing. And the college didn't make any determination, so the classes were going on during the conclave. And as soon as it became evident that the Pope had been elected, there were people who left class. And I remember some of the professors being horribly offended that the students had left for a truly momentous historical occasion. And the Angelicum, I'm sure that was the reason for their determination this year. They put out specific statement. They announced it on social media. As soon as we get news of the white smoke, classes are suspended with immediate effect. The adoration in the chapel at the Angelicum will be closed with benediction so that everybody who wants to can come to Rome, can come to St. Peter's Square and be there for the announcement. When we do get the white smoke, I think you'll all remember, there's a period of time between when the smoke comes out. It's about 40 minutes. We're expecting about 40 minutes to an hour between the white smoke and when the Pope has gotten his robes together. He has prayed for a while. They've organized themselves. So about 40 minutes to an hour. In the last conclave, which of course was absolutely historic because we still had Pope Benedict alive, that was delayed even further because Pope Francis wanted the first one to hear the news to be Pope Emeritus, as he eventually decided on the title, the Pope Emeritus, to be the first to receive the news. So they had to call him. And the story is that he was glued to the TV set watching the chimney as we all are now, and they were ignoring the phone. And finally, someone picked up and said, "It's the Cardinals. They want you to be the first to know." So there's a little delay. We were talking earlier, there are 2 votes in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and the expectation is there's a possibility of maybe as early as 10:30 or 11, but certainly a burning of the ballots at around 1 o'clock for the morning ballots, and then in the afternoon, possibly as early as 5 or 5:30, and certainly a burning of the ballots around. Tomorrow we're looking at perhaps as early as 7:30 for the second one. So if you go to our Vatican News website, you can see kind of a program that will give you an idea of when you can tune in and get the latest news from the
Meanwhile,
conclave.
I'm seeing there 30,000 people in the square at the moment.
30,000?
30,000.
And that will increase until the smoke comes out.
Yeah.
But also, we haven't had an election on the third ballot. We haven't had an election on the second ballot. We have had an election on the third ballot, but not since 1939. And so both Francis and Benedict, I think, were elected on the fourth ballot. So that would mean the evening.
Benedict on the 4th and Francis on the 5th. Although there was a little confusion, which came out subsequently, and as we heard from the oath, the popes can allow people to speak about some aspects of the conclave. That's entirely up to the new pope's discretion. And there was apparently an extra blank ballot added to the vote so that when they counted all the ballots, they had to immediately redo the vote because they want to make absolutely certain that there can be no question about the valid election of the Pope. We know historically that there have been some contested elections.
Occasionally, yes. It's being a very important position. There's sometimes been 2 or even 3 claimants to the papacy. We haven't had that in about 600 years. But the last pope before Benedict to resign, Gregory XII, was one of the 3 popes who they all were either deposed or resigned in order to have the election of Martin V, who restored the papacy to Rome, began the Renaissance here in the city, where we get so many of these beautiful buildings and so many of these beautiful traditions.
So we've all been reading hard about what happens after the Pope out onto that journey of blessings. I think it's called the Loggia. It will be the proto-deacon, right, who will announce the Habemus Papam.
Deacon is elected, and then we'll know even quicker.
Then we'll know even quicker.
And he will give the formula in Latin. He will read the new Pope's name in Latin.
Right.
And then afterwards, the pontiff will step out, if I'm not mistaken.
And that's when he has his first opportunity to introduce himself to the world. Philip, again, you were here. You made the announcement, as I
Yes.
recall, in studio of Pope Francis. But tell us your experience of that night when Pope Francis was elected, both here in the studio, but also as you were looking out at the crowds as they came to see the new Pope.
Yes, you're quite right. We were doing a similar kind of marathon, for the days leading up to the white smoke, and it was the third day, wasn't it, that the actual news came, and second day of the
afternoon
that's right.
of the second
the afternoon. Yes, it was quite late in the evening, which we may be going on to here today as well, but it was a similar sort of time. I seem to remember my other former colleague Susie Hodges was in studio, and as we were watching the smoke started coming out of the chimney, and yes, you could hear the crowd going wild below. It really is. It's quite an extraordinary moment, I think. It's one thing to be here in studio. It's another to be down in the square, I think, because
I was in the square.
You were there, weren't you? You were reporting. You were doing what Devon has been doing for us today, reporting from the square, despite all the difficulties of getting a signal.
I don't think the blockers were as powerful in 2000. I don't think the blockers were as powerful in 2013 because
I can't imagine they have to keep up with such technology
Exactly.
today. You were talking about the sweeping of the Sistine Chapel and also the Santa Marta. I would assume they have to sweep that as well. But the Cardinals had to turn in all of their cell phones. Check your phone at the door, and so they have to.
There's also a bit of a natural blockage that happens, especially after the white smoke, when you go from maybe 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 to suddenly
everyone.
A 250,000 people, 300,000 people, not just in St. Peter's Square, up the Via della Conciliazione, the road leading to, and everybody has their cell phone on. And with great respect for the Italian telecommunications company, that's a big burden for any system. And so when you are trying to get out there and you're trying to send the video of you with the selfie with the new Pope, you might have trouble getting a hold of your friends and family back in England, back in the United States.
That was most noticeable even during the recent funeral for Pope Francis, when you have those numbers. Again, I think the figures were 400,000 officially, weren't they, between those gathered in the square and those who were along Via della Conciliazione and down on the route towards St. Mary Major for the burial when Francis was laid in his final resting place. And again, the difficulty of getting any kind of signal to be able to send messages even was quite challenging. So yes, it is a problem, and people are gathering, and of course everybody now has a phone on them, and everybody. That was another thing I remember, because it was getting dark during the.
I remember
waiting
March,
for Pope Francis.
When the smoke came out, it was dusk, but it was still light out, and by the time they got to the actual pronouncement, the night sky was completely black.
And there was a flashing of all those millions, or at least tens of thousands of cell phones as people tried to take the first pictures of the new Pope. And that is something which, of course, is quite different from in past times when people would acclaim by applauding and cheering. But
applauding and cheering has a lot to say for itself, because I remember being in that square and Bergoglio stepping out. And to be honest, I didn't recognize him. I didn't know who he was. But close to me was a group of Argentinians, pilgrims. And immediately I realized he must be Argentinian, because they went wild. And so I think I was online. I don't remember. I think I said, I think he's an Argentinian.
And then, of course, everybody is looking for the biographies and trying to and the internet risks crashing as well, because everybody is trying to download that biography. Interestingly, I've noticed that the Vatican this time has come up with an extremely helpful dashboard, which again is unprecedented. As far as I remember, we had to do a lot of the research ourselves, but we now have a Vatican dashboard which gives you all the details that you ever wanted to know, or the basic information about the cardinals, all the cardinal electors, who they are, where they come from, how old they are, who created them cardinals, what their main features, if you like, of their ministry has been so far, which is incredibly helpful for all of us trying to cover these
that's
things.
That's progress, Phil. It is two-faced, in the sense that on the one hand, yes, we do have a lot of information much more readily at our fingertips. On the other hand, we are expected to be active on so many more platforms and to be there And so it's been a really steep learning curve for us as well. You know, we're going to have to be there when the smoke is white. We're going to take a screenshot. We're going to do a video. We're going to have a name out there. It's very challenging for journalists this time and age.
And Linda, I'd like to go back to something you said about the applause, where applause is very significant. As you mentioned, Dawn, in the past, sometimes it was by acclaim. It was the voice of the people of the city of Rome. But even today, in various liturgies, we hear the people have an opportunity to signify their acceptance. And it's not a legalistic form, but there is a place for the people to express their approval of a choice of a priest, of a bishop, and less formally here for the Pope.
Well, Saint Cyprian, when he was defending the papacy of Cornelius, this was in 250 A.D., he said that the clergy of Rome consented to him. He was ordained by all the bishops and by the acclamation of the people. And so this is actually, it is kind of liturgical, the reception of the Pope coming out on the loggia, and then the people acceding to that election in the square. It's a very important moment. Now, sometimes the people historically have not always been so desires known. So at the beginning, when Urban VI was elected, they made it very clear that they wanted an Italian, the people of Rome, and so that was an important way. And that's a way historically that synodality can work out too, and a way that people can have their voices heard. And this is a very historical way that people have had their voices heard.
When you mentioned that we were talking earlier about acclaiming the Pope, and thinking back to that election in 2013, of course, you have that incredible acclamation and cheering. But then the other lasting memory that I have is Pope Francis asking the people to pray for him before he gave them the blessing. And in an instant, you had however many thousands of people there were in the square falling silent. And so you had this extraordinary contrast between the noise of the cheering and the applause, and then the silence as he stood there for really quite a long time, with asking people to pray for him and to pray for his new ministry. That was really quite something unusual, I found.
The sentry seagull is back, waiting for the news.
Waiting for the news. I'm reading something quite unusual for me. I'm reading that it could even be possible that today, in the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals have actually not voted, and therefore there will not be a signal. It's a remote possibility, but it exists.
Yeah, the procedures that govern everything from the moment we learn of the death of the Holy Father, or the moment of his resignation, through the ceremonies to say farewell to the previous Pope, through the period of mourning, the organization of the conclave, how the College of Cardinals organizes the events, to the entry into the conclave, and all of the details of the voting are laid out very, very precisely in a document which we've heard many times, Universi Dominici Gregis, the name of the document that covers all of this. And what that document foresees is that normally the cardinals would proceed immediately to a vote this evening. However, that's not an absolute, and there is admittedly a pretty remote possibility that they don't proceed immediately to a vote. There's also what would be a very strange possibility, but we've talked about this earlier, not unheard of, if the cardinals should choose someone who is not in the Sistine Chapel, they might take a vote, but the vote is not formalized and elect a pope, but the pope is not elected until he accepts. So you wouldn't burn the ballots, you wouldn't see the white smoke, and meanwhile the cardinal electors would have to call outside the cardinal, probably make a phone call, and ask their choice to become pope. And in that case, we would not see the smoke, and then people would really start talking.
Yes, that would be a journalistic crisis for sure at that.
And the question: when was the last pope who was not in the conclave to be elected?
It was Urban VI. It was that election right before the Great Western Schism. He was the Archbishop of Bari, and so they elected someone outside of the conclave, and so they had to send him notice of that. And it took a long while, and the people of Rome were relatively restless until they found out that, don't worry, we have elected an Italian. And they all went home and had a party. So.
Meanwhile, as we've been chatting away,